So the armholes of the Leralynn dress are finished with bias tape. And you can buy bias tape. For this pattern, you're going to use 1/2 inch wide single fold bias tape. But you can also make it, and when you make it, I think you get nicer fabrics and you get to add a fun little touch of personalization. So this is some bias tape that I made, and I'm going to show you how to do that. First, let's talk about what is bias grain. So when you buy fabric, it has these more densely woven edges, and those are called the selvage edges. And parallel to the selvage edge is the straight grain. Perpendicular to the selvage edge is the cross grain, and if you go to 45-degree angle, that's the bias grain. The bias grain is useful when you're working with something curved like an armhole, because on the bias, fabric has a little bit of stretch and give. That makes it easier for you to be able to mold and shape the fabric around something curved like an armhole. So in order to make bias tape, you can actually make yards and yards of this stuff out of just a fat quarter, which is what I've got here. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your edges and your corners are square. So I like to use the rotary mat and line up the edges of my fabric to the lines on the mat and then make sure they're square. If they're not, then you can use the ruler and square up those edges to make sure that it's all 90 degrees. Once you've got your square piece, all you need to do to find the bias is fold it in half to make a triangle. And then a lot of these bigger rotary mats, they actually have a 45-degree line on them, and you can cut your fabric right on that line with the ruler and the rotary cutter. But I prefer to cut with scissors most of the time. So what I do is I fold my fabric into a triangle, and then I move over to the iron, and I like to press that edge. Especially if I'm using quilting cotton, which is what I most often use to make bias tape. This works really well because the cotton will hold the crease mark, and then when I get back to cut it, I've got a nice line and I can see right where my bias is and cut it. So find your bias, use your rotary mat or use your scissors and an iron and cut right across the center of your square on that bias line. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew our first seam here. So you flip one triangle that way, and you're going to put the other triangle this way. And we're going to stitch along this edge. Now I want to point out here that I've got a little bit of overhang of the triangle here and a little bit of overhang here. That's because when I get to the machine, I want the needle lined up right where the two fabrics meet each other. And that's going to give me one straight piece. You'll see what I mean after we stitch this. If you'd like to pin this to hold it in place, you can. I feel secure that it's not going anywhere. So I'm going to move to the machine. I'm going to line up my fabric, and then I'm just going to stitch that seam. And again, you can see, let me stitch past and I'll pull it out where you can see more easily. You can see that the needle and the stitching crossed right at where the two edges of the fabric met at that point. After you've got this seam stitched, you want to move over to the iron and you want to press the seam open flat. And I like to press it from both sides just to make sure that I get it nice and flat. So because of the way we've sewn this together, we now have these long edges here. This is on the bias grain of the fabric because this right here was the cross grain and the straight grain. So what we want to do now is take our ruler, and you're going to take a marking tool, and we're going to mark in 1-inch increments. So I'm marking, and then I'm going to move my ruler over onto that line and mark the next one. Let me show you the one I've already got marked. When you're done, it's going to look like this. You've got your pressed open seam, and you're going to have a bunch of lines marked. Those lines are all on the bias grain of the fabric. So now it's time to sew our other seam. What we're going to do is we want to match this edge up here to this edge down here, and we're going to sew those two together. We want to offset when we're matching them. So I'm going to look over here, and here's my first line and my second line. I want to match the end to the second line there. So you can see how those match together. I'm going to put them right sides together. And what I like to do is I like to poke my pin through the line at the seam line there, so a 1/2 inch in, and then make sure that on the other end the pin is poking through in the same place, and that helps me line it up here. You want to go all the way across, matching those up, and then the other corner should hit this line with one offset on that end as well. Okay, sometimes you need more than 2 pins, sometimes 2 is enough. Whatever works for you, that's how many you use. And then we're going to stitch this seam. So put it in the machine, make sure these raw edges are lined up before you lower the presser foot, and then you're just going to stitch. Make sure the raw edges stay lined up with each other as you stitch. And then you can see what we have made here is a tube. And this tube is offset. So you've got an offset where we started and an offset where we're going to end. What that allows you to do is to cut all of this continuously in one spiral. So you're just going to now follow the lines that you drew before you started stitching and cut right along them. And when you get to the seams, you cut straight across them, following your lines. And as you can see, what happens is you're starting to get this long piece of bias tape. When you get all the way to the end of cutting this spiral, you're going to have one long continuous piece of tape. And then the final step with that is to be able to press it so that it has these edges folded in like the finished piece does. So you can do that by hand by just pulling both of those pressed edges towards the center on the wrong side, but there's a good chance you'll burn your fingers if you try it that way. So I use this other little tool, this bias tape maker, to do that. And what you do is you take your bias tape and you're going to feed it on into the tool. And this is a 1/2 inch bias tape maker because we want to end up with 1/2 inch tape. So you feed it into the bias tape maker, and you can see as it gets pulled out, it has those folds already in it. So then all you have to do is follow with the iron to press the folds in towards the center. And what you end up with is just like what I showed you, my finished tape, where these ends are pressed in towards the center, and it's now bias tape that's ready to use. So now that we've got that done, let's sew some welt pockets.